Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And my oh my, Faith, I have been waiting to talk to you for months, and I'm so grateful that you've made this time to spend with us today. I want to do a brief introduction about your background and your work, your books, your TED Talk. You're awesome. Let me start by just lauding you. You are a graduate summa cum laude of Georgetown School of Foreign Service, as well as honors from the UC Berkeley Law School. You're a corporate attorney. You go all over the world. You do acquisitions and contract law, and you've done an awesome TEDx talk. I've watched it 3 times now when I first heard of your existence, and then as recently as this morning again, I wanted to refresh myself. So you've written Sex Cult Nun, which is your autobiographical memoir. It's in there with educated and uncultured and other incredible stories of amazing women who've come out of such an abusive, authoritarian, religious cult background, the children of God. I should say you're kind of royalty in the sense that your grandfather was the cult leader. It's kind of infamous, but whatever. And you realized you love to learn and you are stifled and you don't want to, have sex with people who just say, I own you, or because God says so, I can take you, and just all incredible amount of child abuse. This is a cult I've worked with since my own deprogramming from the Moonies back in '76. I've met many people who've exited the Children of God, now known as the family. And I want to highlight your I own me, understanding our property rights to our own bodies, and your code framework that I'm going to ask you to explain to our audience. What else am I missing? You have a course. I was looking at your corporate course, which I'm personally interested. I probably will take it because I want to learn more, even though I have an S corp disclosure, and jurisdiction is here in Massachusetts. Anyway, I'm sorry, I lapsed. So your memoir, Sex Cult Nun, your book, I Own Me, your TEDx talk. You're a passionate advocate for freedom and especially women's rights. How did I do for an intro? Faith Jones.
Good intro, yes.
Okay, great. So, my oh my. So, I guess for my listeners who may not have heard you on Terry Gross Fresh Air and a million other interviews you've done with Sex Cult Nun, can you just give our listeners a framework? You grew up in, I think, Macau, and just let people know about the Children of God, a family cult first, and then we can move on your evolution to helping others.
Yes. So the Children of God was actually founded by my family. So my father, my mother was one of the early people who joined it. She was a hippie, very idealistic, wanting to save the world. My grandfather was the guru or the prophet of the group.
Mm.
And it began in Huntington Beach, California, I think in like 1968. And from there, it's quickly gathered momentum, hundreds of followers, then thousands, and then it spread all over the world. And it was a very, I think there's a new movie out called The Jesus People or something. So it was one of the original Jesus People organizations. They directed most of their efforts towards the hippies, groups of young people who were disenfranchised, who'd left home already, who were very anti the system. Right. So they had a great pool of people who really wanted to save the world, change things. Right. And my grandfather and the organization gave them a mission, gave them a focus. Right. And initially it was very Bible, based kind of Bible thumping. Everybody was memorizing a lot of verses and just kind of constantly staying in this state of I guess, brainwashing, so to speak, but with the Bible.
He was a master.
And So it eventually, there was also a very strong element of authoritarianism in it
Yep.
that was even there from the very beginning. Even though some of the weirder, like sexual doctrines, didn't really come into it until some years later,
Yeah.
the authoritarianism was definitely there, and that system
Yeah,
of
well, when you're
control.
the prophet of God and whatever you says goes, and you have Armageddon any moment, so you have a lot of fear, manipulation, you have a lot of power.
Yes, and utilizing he used the scriptures, but he twisted the interpretation of them to
Exactly.
make whatever he was saying. He was a brilliant man. He was very, very
Hmm.
intelligent, very high IQ. But he used that knowledge to cause, the Bible says like that Satan uses the knowledge to cause death, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times people who are very manipulative like that, they can be very, very smart, but then they're using their understanding in a way that is very negative for other people,
Yep.
especially
Yep.
creating these kind of coercive groups. So when I wrote the book Sex Cult Nun, I I wanted to portray the family, which is later became known as the family. It was originally called
Right.
the Children of God, and they changed their name
Yep.
um, to the family of love when there was a practice called FFing, and then eventually just the family.
Yeah, flirty fishing is FFing for the listeners who may not know that much about this group. Sending women out to recruit, to have sex at bars, to make money, to bring people in to get curry favor with politicians. Please go on.
Yes, yeah. Uh, so I mean, I think one of the couple of the doctrines that really made this group hit the papers, right, was because it was initially a fundamentalist Christian group, but then my grandfather, due to his own predilections, I mean, he was an adulterer. He was having sex outside of marriage while he was still pastoring churches in, like, I think it was the Church of Christ or other, just
Uh
sort of more
huh.
the mainstream. And so he obviously had these predilections,
And he was a
and he
pedophile
was a
too, I
pedophile.
believe.
Yes,
Yeah.
his daughter even spoke about that in the publications, just
Right.
openly, like it wasn't a bad thing at all, right? Like, oh yeah.
Right.
So he took this, and he'd also experienced child abuse at a very young age himself, and he thought,
Many
oh, this is
abusers are.
great. This is
Yeah.
So he then began to take verses from the Bible and twist them to make it seem like these kinds of actions were okay,
Right.
right? Or that they were blessed
Exactly.
or God given. And so for me, there was definitely a journey later in life, even now, going back and looking at the scriptures and saying, well, actually, this is not what it's saying at all, right? When
Right.
you're looking
I,
at it based in context, based in, everything else, it's just like,
theology, people actually know the Bible.
yeah, this
Yeah, I had to
is
do
like,
the same thing with the Moonies when I got out. It's like, what does it actually say? Oh, they were cherry picking verses and putting their own meaning and spin on things.
yes,
Please
yeah,
continue.
exactly. So that's and of course, like almost all religious organizations do this. They tend to do this.
The good ones don't,
Very
and
few
the
don't.
unhealthy ones do.
Very few
Yes.
don't. And but there are some that don't. I think there are some people that are really uh, intellectually honest in the sense that they go after studying, the ancient texts and really trying to identify what it was actually saying in the original, not trying to make it fall in line with whatever their pet doctrine or dogma is. And
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I highly appreciate that. I value that. And for myself, that is how I have been trying to approach it in
Hmm.
recent years. And it is a challenge, to get rid of all of these interpretations that exist in your mind that you were trained in so long to see. When you read those words, you see this one interpretation of it. But in
Right.
fact, someone says, actually, no, it doesn't mean that at all. It actually means this. And you go and you study the original language and you're like, oh, wait, you're right. It doesn't, but
It's
it's
rewiring your
rewiring your
brain
brain.
and your beliefs because it's the same for all my clients in religious cults, honestly. And I do want to mention I interviewed a friend who is in another Bible cult called the International Churches of Christ, which right now have a big set of lawsuits of people who were abused sexually in that particular cult. His name is Chris Lee. He was recruited at MIT, and he decided to go to seminary because he wanted to figure out the Bible. So he's actually, a self-professing Christian who is an ex-member who's trying to help people get out, but he's not recruiting them to believe like he believes. He just wants to share what his journey is in an ethical way.
Yes.
So I think people like this exist out there.
Absolutely. And, for me, that's been my journey as well to figure that out. And I had to go very far over to, just pure logic and then be able to come back into saying, okay, now let me use critical thinking and observe these things and see, what is accurate and what is not accurate. Right.
Yep.
And so anyway, with the group itself, the group, like I said, in the early 70s, so you have to understand like the time frame. So in my book, I take people I give them a brief history of the group, and then I take them really starting from my childhood, like when I'm like 4 years old, is some of my earliest memories, and describing this, running away in the middle of the night and, going out to this farm in the middle of nowhere in Macau, and, we're escaping bad publicity and, what my parents call persecution from the authorities and so on. So, and then I take you through, though, more in like a novel format where it's immediate in the moment, because I wanted people to know this is what I was thinking at that time. So I had to do a lot of time traveling myself to go back, put myself in that mind frame, read a lot of the literature again, and like go back so that I was really there and I could say, okay, yeah, I remember this is what I was thinking. This is what it smelled like. This is, these experiences, to give people a more detailed, vivid picture, but also to understand what's inside people's minds when they're in this. Yep. It's not, and I don't think I couldn't do that by doing a look back. Oh, this bad thing happened to me, that bad thing, right? And applying judgment on it from a current knowledge of what is real, right? Because I grew up in this, so that was all I knew. So I was portraying, this is what I believed or thought or was told at that moment, and how I was viewing situations that were happening to me and to others. Yeah. So I think that makes it a bit different than a lot of cult books that are out there. Because a lot of times people are writing about their experiences in the past, right?
Yeah. Well, for me, I was recruited at 19, so I had an identity. I had a childhood to reference, but so it was a different experience than folks that like yourself who were raised in it, thought everything was normal until you got validation. No, this is not normal. You're right. You should resent this. You should be able to say no and not have somebody quote scripture and say that you're being a bad person and you're not doing God's will and all that crap.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So that was, I think a lot of the things that are in your model obviously were used in the group, and so there was sexual abuse, there was child sexual abuse for, a certain number of years earlier on. And then that became taboo. But there was still...
because of the law, going after them.
Yes, because of the law going after them. Exactly.
It wasn't internal. It was the public going,
well, there was some stuff that was internal as well, because they'd actually done a survey of all the young teenagers. They did like a questionnaire of all the young teenagers, and a lot of them were reporting really negative impacts of adult sexuality. So it was both. I think they were seeing that this was actually not bearing this supposed good fruit, too. So I think but I think probably more so was the outside influence, for sure, because they didn't really retract it, at least not at that time, not until much later. But there was also, despite that, like even ending the child abuse aspect of it, there was still like a lot of physical discipline. But then when
corporal punishment
for the adult women,
horrible corporal punishment.
Yes, there's very bad corporal punishment. Restriction of food, isolation, wearing signs. I was on silence restriction for like a month. I wasn't allowed to speak. So there's a lot of very intensive coercive punishment.
Yep.
But what didn't change was this sense of, and I write about my experiences with basically coercive sex, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
which is rape. And I didn't realize it
Yep.
at the time, but being forced to have sex with people who I didn't want to, but being told this is God's will. If you don't, you're disobedient, you're rebellious against God, you
Right.
know, and even, you know, you'll be humiliated publicly and, you know, sort of, uh, um, punished, vilified because of your lack of submission to God, right? So, so when I really, so years after I left, I really didn't leave because and this is what most people don't understand. Um, so there was a lot of other positive things,
Mm.
and people don't, like they say, people don't join a cult; they join a family, right? And you
Or they're
get,
born into a
or they're born
family.
into
Yeah.
it, right? But
Yeah.
people are getting love bombed, right? They're getting shown this purpose. You know, there's a lot of beautiful things in the Bible. There's a lot of great encouraging things
Yeah.
in the Bible. So, you know, you're kind of at this place where it's both really horrible and damaging, and then yet there's these other really good positive things, right? Like
Mm.
people living communally. Well, when you're having a bunch of people having a whole ton of kids, be very hard to support and care for yourself when you don't have a
Mm-hmm.
group helping you, like someone's
Right.
cooking, someone's taking the children, right? It's like,
Right.
so, and I think that locked a lot of people in too, because you weren't supposed to have jobs or economic income. So because of
The
that, people would get
systemites, right?
trapped.
The evil outside world, right? That's going to be destroyed at any moment.
Yes,
So
yeah.
there's that
And then
piece
using
too.
Bible verses to justify that as well, right?
Right.
Bible verses that should not have been used for that purpose. So,
Exactly.
you know, when you combine all of that, it's very hard. It's very hard for people to leave, especially people who have big families, right? And then there was
Yes.
also the threat that your kids were going to be taken away from you if you left, or if one parent left, then the family would help the other parent, like take the
Right.
kids away to some other country where they couldn't get them, right? So there's just
Yep.
so much going on in this group. But at the same point, you know, so many of the people in the group were really there because they genuinely believed, because they
Mm.
genuinely wanted to serve God. They genuinely wanted to help others. Of course, there were some people, like terrible people, who I think were abusing
Sure.
that relationship. And so, you know, when I left, I was like, you know, I could see some of the good. I could see the idealism. I could see this terrible stuff happening as well.
Yeah.
It's like, what's wrong here?
Yeah.
What is the seed of corruption? What is the thing that is making this go so bad? Right?
Yeah.
Um, and it wasn't until like almost 20 years after I left the group. So I
Mm-hmm.
left in my early 20s. So that really kind of takes you up. And I went to college, and it takes you through that progression of my life, you know.
Yes.
And I was able, fortunately, to put myself through school with a correspondence course when I was still in the group, but we were kind of like on the edge. And then
Right.
when I left, I really left to go to school. I left because I just longed to learn and to just have my mind expanded. I couldn't stand being in this incredibly restrictive environment where you had to read the same
Yes.
stuff and doctrines and teachings over and over and over again.
Yes.
And so it wasn't until after I left that I began to experience more of a different view of the world, that I was able, it took a few years to look back on how I was brought up and say, wait, those things are wrong now, right? I had to create
Right.
a whole mental model, a new mental model for myself.
Definitely.
And I think don't maybe appreciate how important that is for people who come out of cults, this need to create a new mental model of the world.
100%.
And that it
You
takes
know, a
time.
new identity that isn't cult based, and using your own experience as a base and your own body as a base. And we could talk for hours, Faith, but I really want to hone in on your expertise as an attorney and get to your code model about I own me. And because, as you know, I went back and did my doctoral work because I realized the law needs to be updated. Like, it's not a slippery slope. We can actually, you know, define this and protect human rights using trafficking law. And then when I heard your model, it was a completely different model, but completely dovetailed with your model. So please share I own me, and understanding our property rights to our own bodies,
Yes.
please.
So that was when I came to the realization that the key thing that was missing, and that was in the group, they had convinced everybody that they did not own themselves. That was the first lie, right?
Yeah.
To say, I don't own myself. I have no property right in my body. My body
Yeah,
belongs.
God owns it,
right?
Which means the cult owns it.
Yes, Now, if you truly are dedicating your life to God or to a moral code, right, and that's your choice and you're doing it and you're saying, I want to live according to this moral code, that's great, right? That's between you and God. But once another human steps in and takes that role and starts coercing you in the name of God, or saying, I'm the conduit between you and God, or I'm God's voice to tell you what to do with your life, that's when we have the issue, right? So in this case, the group, the leaders were saying, you need to turn over your body sexually. You need to turn over all of your belongings, all the money you make, everything you earn, right? If you didn't own yourself, well, then you didn't own anything you created. So they had control over everything from the very basis. So when I got that first primary principle, that really our entire moral code is based in this concept, it's based in just these few rings, which I can show you right here. Everything we consider the moral law is actually falls into one of these rings. And I've shown this to a number of attorneys. I was at a conference and a whole room full of attorneys, and I told them I could show you all the moral law on one piece of paper. And I have another one that shows like contract law and criminal law, like on the sides of the paper.
I want to do presentations with you to judges and attorneys, Faith. This is such vital.
Yeah, and so the lawyer looked at it and was like, 3 years of law school down the drain.
No, you're brilliant. I love your conceptualization. Let's dive in and explain.
So please. It begins with our very first primary principle is I own my body, right? I have a moral right to my body. If I don't have a property right in my body, then there would be no moral wrong in things like slavery, right? Or murder or assault. And it's a violation of that property right in my body that is some of our most heinous crimes: rape, assault, murder, right? Those are all violations of my property right in my body.
Yeah, if I may interrupt, please forgive me, but when I first got involved with this forensic think tank at Harvard Medical School, and my law professor friend Alan Shefflin talked to me about undue influence and how it was a 300-year-old law, British common law. It was about property rights. It wasn't about psychological rights. It was about making sure your heirs got the property, not some caregiver or the church that would usurp and take away your property. So I just want to dovetail that one critical piece, that the law was based on property.
Yes, and I'm going to bring that in when we get to the next ring, because that is an element of that, exactly. So once I understood that I have a property in my body, the next ring is, well, that means that I own everything that I create from my body, from my efforts, right? So then we have a whole other field of law, intellectual property rights. If I paint a painting, that's my painting. I get to sell it, right? I get to take the money from it. That takes us to the next ring, right? So it's this understanding. Once you violate the first principle, you can violate all the others with impunity, right? So once I have something that I have created, right? Maybe that is my skills as an attorney. Maybe that is I make an invention, right? The law protects those things, my property. And the next thing is the deal. Now, the circle of the deal involves everything we consider both relationships and contract law. So if you are the only human on earth, none of this would matter, right? The whole point of the moral law is that there is a way that we have to interact with each other so that we both are claiming our own rights and not violating another's rights. So the relationship of the deal, and this is what you learn in your very first contracts class in law school, is the 5 elements that create a good or a valid or enforceable contract. But when I looked at those 5 elements, I recognized that if any one of those elements was missing, it's morally repugnant to us to enforce such a contract, right? We just know that that's absolutely wrong. That would be like theft of property to enforce the contract.
Lack of informed consent, right? Is one of your
Exactly.
big things,
Exactly.
right?
So, first of all, you have to both understand what it is you're making a contract about. If I think you're taking me out to dinner so that I can get to know you, and you think you're taking me out to dinner so that you can have sex, we're not on the same page about what this agreement is about, right?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
So, and this is what I mean. It's not just in contract, it goes to every aspect of relationship between adults, right? Now, you have a mother has unconditional love for her small child and will just give and give and give. But in all adult relationships, there's always some kind of exchange. There's a whole field called transactional analysis of psychology that talks about all of the subtle exchanges that we do all the time, right? So first of all, you got to understand what you're actually exchanging. What's the deal here, right?
Yes.
There has to be an exchange of value. If there's no exchange of value, then it can be a gift, but gifts are not enforceable. Okay? So it's a gift if there's no exchange of value. You have to have acceptance. That's free willing acceptance. You can call that a consent, right? You got to say, this is the deal. This is what I'm offering. You have to accept it willingly. The fourth ring is you have to have the mental capacity to understand what you're doing. This is why we do not allow children to contract. We do not allow people who have dementia, right? If you do not have the mental capacity to understand the implications, the future implications of what you're doing, we can't enforce that contract against you, right? And that is a whole field of abuse. That's this comes into where they say, well, the child wanted it, or the child, wanted to do the sexual act or whatever it was. Well, they don't have the ability. They can't consent because they have no idea how that's going to impact them in the future, right? And then the fifth ring goes directly to what Dr. Hassan's thesis is, which is undue pressure, right? Now, undue pressure is almost always the main one that gets violated, right? And so when you look at all the crimes that happen in this ring, right, you have fraud, that's lying about what the deal actually is. You have blackmail, which is undue pressure, right? And you have breach of contract, right? So those are all fall within the law within that ring. When we're talking about relationships, that undue pressure element, it goes to so many things. It's not just like straight up blackmail, right? It's not like where I'm just saying, if you don't pay me $10,000, I'm going to post these photos of you on the internet, right? That's not, it's not so direct like that. It can be guilt, right? It can be fear of punishment. It can be God is going to punish you. There's just so many ways, like even just your mother guilting you into coming home for the holidays, right?
Yes.
That's undue pressure too.
That's emotional
It's
control,
emotional
right?
control, exactly. So once you recognize this, and this is one of the reasons I like what Dr. Hassan is doing. But
it's Hassan, by the way.
Hassan?
It's all good.
Sorry, Hassan. Okay.
Just call me Steve. It works.
Steve. All right. Steve. One of the reasons I like what Steve is doing is that he's bringing clarity to this to this principle of undue pressure, which is often feels a bit vague for people. And I want people to understand that it can be much more subtle than what you would typically think of. Like he's saying, it's usually used in, the elderly, right? Pressuring old people to change their wills or so on and so forth.
Right.
And that's where it often comes into the law. But in fact, we use it a lot in contract law as well. It is an important element of contract law. So if there's an element of blackmail or something happening, well, then you can't enforce that contract, right? But then you get into the issue of, well, how strong does it have to be, blah, 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 right? So that creates more of a question there. But I want just people to be aware of it, because if you have an absolute right to your body, if you have the absolute right to your time, right, then, and you know that in your heart, then nobody can pressure you in that way. Because even if they tell you, oh, well, you're a bad person if you don't want to give money to my church or to, whatever it is, right? You say, no, I own myself. I own my money. I don't have to do it. I don't have to give it to anybody. I'm not a bad person if I don't do it.
Right.
And then you can make a choice from your free will, right?
Right.
And that's a very different place to be seating. If my mother is giving me a guilt trip about not coming home for the holidays, right? Then I can just separate that commentary and say, look, that's none of that is valid.
Yeah,
But
you can name it and say,
yes,
"Hey, you're guilt tripping me.
yes, you're guilt
That's not
tripping me.
motivating me to want to hang out with you, Ma."
Exactly. You say that, you say you're guilt tripping me. I fully own myself and my body and my time. However, maybe I really do love my mother and I want her to be happy, and her happiness um, makes me happy too, right? Like,
Right.
I value that relationship. So
Right.
then I might choose to do it out of a sense of value for it versus whatever she's trying to do, right? I can kind of ignore that and say, okay, I value this, so I'm going to do it. It doesn't mean you just reject it out of hand because someone's trying to manipulate you. You have to look at it for yourself and say, what is it that I value? What is it that I get from this? And can I make a free choice to do it willingly and happily? Because I know I'm doing it for the right reason.
And with my therapist hat, I would say you can say back to your mother, mother, when you say it this way, it makes me feel guilt and it makes me want to rebel. But if you said it as, darling, I miss you, I love you, I would relish to spend time with you, could you please come and visit? Then I'd be freely motivated to want to hang out with you. So you can teach, in other words,
Absolutely.
and uplift. But I want to highlight something that's really in my mind that really is so upsetting, and that is corporal punishment. Beating children, which we know is traumatizing to the brain. Like I have a colleague who's a Harvard trained psychiatrist who does the top, research on child brain development, and he's like, this is categorically bad for children. And yet, the United States, unlike most civilized countries, says no, a parent should be able to, or a school even, should be able to take a wooden board and beat the crap out of a child. And I just like, how do we deal with that religious freedom, air quotes, to say nope, let's ignore science, let's ignore the child's right to say, I don't want to grow up a traumatized, dissociated person. I want to have a healthy life.
So that's a great question. So in the book behind me, I Own Me, it's actually a guidebook for women, or really for anybody who to understand these different elements of abuse. So
Mm,
corporal physical abuse is one of the things I talk about, right? So I go through rape, I go through,
mm,
women's inability to say no, sometimes like the fears, and I go through each of these different things, and I talk about corporal punishment in there as well. And corporal punishment and other types of abuse, it's also going to another factor, which I said, first of all, there is a legal fiction, a legal concept in our country that children are the property of their parents. Okay.
I,
Now,
I,
unfortunately, they've done something worse now in trying to make children the property of the state. But children are not property. Children
yes,
are humans already with all of their rights fully formed, right? And that fiction is what allows people to think, well, it's my child, it's my property. I can do what I want with it, right? I can spank it, I can beat it. And if you're talking to psychologists, they'll even tell you that even with abusive spouses, right? There's this concept that the person is an extension of themselves versus their own independent person with their own rights, feelings, and
right,
thoughts. So that's when you also that runs over into, well, you're mine, so I can do what I want to. I can hit you, beat you, etc. So
right,
that concept is an element, right? And that is
yeah,
something that we have to counteract. And what I talk about in my book is I say that we should not see children as our property, right? Because each person is their own consciousness from the moment they're born. So if it's not like when you turn 18, somebody waves a magic wand over your head and all of a sudden you have rights, right?
mm,
That's not how life
right,
works, right?
right,
So to start with, for parents to really see themselves as stewards, not
yeah.
owners. And I
Totally.
think that term is saying this is stewardship. I have these parameters that I'm not supposed to abuse them, beat them, starve them, kill them. Like I'm a steward,
Totally.
and my job is to do my best to raise a healthy, functioning adult, which can make good decisions. And
Exactly.
by good decisions, we mean knows how to take into account long-term consequences of things, right? So
Right.
it's a totally different framework for raising children. The
Yeah. Do you know
other,
Marcy Hamilton's work, the law professor, CEO of ChildUSA.org? She's exactly on this point. She's like, children are not property, and her organization that's been working to get rid of statute of limitation for child sexual abuse says that the neuropsychiatric definition now is 25 for adulthood. It's not even 18 in terms of the science.
mhm, yeah.
From anyway, keep going, please, with your model.
Okay, now I lost where I was.
I apologize. No, you were
That's okay.
talking about children are not property. Parents should be stewards to bring out the uniqueness in their children.
Right. And then the other point I bring up is those 2 points really. It's just the illogic of someone saying, I'm going to hit you so that you don't learn to hit, so you don't hit others. It's just completely illogical. Like, you hit Susie, now I'm going to smack you. Like, how am I teaching them not to hit? Like, that just doesn't make any sense to me, right? Just
Right.
from a purely logical standpoint. But the
Yep.
other element is this belief that the Bible teaches physical abuse, right? And
Well, there's a line from the Old
right,
Testament.
there's a number of
That's
lines. There's quite a few lines,
mm,
like "spare the rod, spoil the child." That's a
that's
favorite
the
one,
main
right?
one. Yep.
Um, which is and then there's other But I remember reading this great uh, sort of overview from a pastor who was walking through it and saying, actually, this doesn't mean what you think it means, right?
Mm,
A lot of these verses, the rod wasn't that you were supposed to beat somebody with a rod, right? When they were talking about the rod, they were talking about the rod in the sense of like how a shepherd deals with his sheep, right?
mm,
So the
mm,
rod was a symbol of love, was a symbol
mm,
of governance, was a symbol of, maybe boundaries or guidance, okay?
mm.
And, if you're looking at the Lord's Prayer, right? It's like, or many other verses in the Bible, right? It talks about discipline. It doesn't say beating. Okay. It
Right.
says discipline. Well, there are many forms of discipline. You know, there are,
Totally.
you can restrict things. You can let someone suffer the consequences of their action. You do this, you don't get to go here, right? You don't want to eat this, you don't get
Sure.
that, right? It's like there's consequences to action. That is a
Sure.
much more natural form of discipline versus beating, right? And the other
Thousand
thing is,
percent.
like, when the Bible talks about the rod, it's not saying beat somebody with it, right? The shepherd didn't beat the sheep with the rod.
Right.
The rod was used to defend the sheep against wolves,
Right.
okay? And it was used to guide the sheep. They'd put it on one side of the sheep and be like, come away from there. If the sheep was about to fall off a cliff, they would use it to catch them and pull them back, right?
Right.
It wasn't to beat the sheep with, right?
Right.
So
Agreed.
it's taking people have taken what their culture has told them, right? This
Mm,
Judeo-German culture of this very strict, like beating children as a way to, you know, uh, engender submission versus like
right.
growth, right? And then they took those verses from the Bible and applied it to that.
Mm.
Versus saying, well, what could this really mean that's not maybe beating and violating somebody's body?
Yeah, but America needs to pass the rights of the child and abolish corporal punishment. Period. That's my firm opinion as a therapist and a mind control expert. And you're absolutely right. I think when people say, "Why are Americans so violent?" Look at who's beaten as a child and told, "Let me make a lesson out of this." And huh? As opposed to role modeling, talking with words and explaining what the advantages are by exerting self control or by not harming somebody else.
Yeah. Alice Miller's work I found was very helpful for me.
Yes. Yeah.
Alice Miller she had some great books on that. And she catalogs for different people like Hitler and other people in history what their early childhood experiences were with abuse and how that kind of helped form who they became. And to me, that was very helpful just in even understanding my parents and understanding the people who had abused me. You know, it was helpful for me to be able to have a different perspective on that.
Yes, definitely. So I want to ask you some questions, attorney, if I may. So there was a lawsuit by three people who were born into Scientology. As children, they signed a billion-year contract to work for the organization, and they were suing the leader and the group for trafficking because they were paid like $50 a month for years and years and years and years. And a judge recently presumably said, nope, the Scientology has binding arbitration, and therefore they're not able to bring, even though they left the cult, they're not able to bring a suit because the culture of the group says that we don't respect the law. You have to have binding arbitration within the cult. How does that make any sense at all?
Well, I can't say I know all the facts. So as an attorney, I have to say you have to know
Yeah.
all the facts because it's
Yeah.
very fact dependent. But I will say this. If a child signed a contract, it's not valid. You can't enforce a contract that a child signs, right? And obviously, this is a contract for a billion years. I mean, it's just not even like rational, right?
Right.
So it would seem to be a ridiculous contract anyway. But the
Yeah.
first element, which is what I told you in that framework, is that if a child signs a contract, it's not enforceable. Now, did these people sign another contract later after they were 18, right? That enabled them to enforce an arbitration clause against them? I don't know. But
Yeah.
I don't think you can also just say, well, just because this religious organization doesn't believe in it, you can't do it. That doesn't make sense to me. But the truth is, there's so much of our law, government, and this is one of the things that really upsets me now, is all of the abuses of our government against people. All the ways our government violates these principles against people. We don't have a justice system anymore. Like, and a lot of people are not aware of how bad it has become. They've passed all of these laws that really make it almost impossible for people to get a fair trial to a large extent because you can, like I know somebody who was, I think he wrote a book about it. He was actually thrown in jail, felony. He was an Iranian student here studying for his MBA, and the DA, who wanted to make a name for himself, decided to go after the guy and accused him of, violating America's laws about like money laundering with Iran, right? Which he wasn't doing. And there's a very clear provision in the law that states your parents or your relatives can give you money so you can buy a house in America if you're here studying, right? You can buy a condo or whatever, right? So that's what he had done. And the judge refused to allow the testimony of the guy who'd written the law. He was the one who'd actually written the law. They refused to allow his testimony, which obviously was completely irrelevant, right?
Right.
And so then he got sentenced to felony. He was in jail for 2 years fighting to get out again and like fighting on appeals and everything. And of course, the DA goes away with this big woohoo, we got him, right? And eventually, it was appealed. Eventually, he was released, but his life is ruined, right? Just got his felony record, and that's just one example. I mean, there's many examples of the government literally stealing from people. So we talk about all this stuff, like, and so another example of a law like that, a client of mine, this was maybe 15 years ago. So this is not new. When I'm telling you this stuff, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these instances, and this is not new, where they took a law which was originally designed only to be used against like the mob, right? Like Al Capone, the mob, and so on. And now they use it all the time against regular Americans and business people. And so in this case, what the state did was they went after, so this was like 15, 20 years ago, they went after my client. And he was a young businessman at the time. He was selling supplements online, or whatever, right? So they went after him for an FTC violation, saying he's like making claims about his stuff that's not true, right? And But what they did is they took his account, and he had $1 million in there. They froze his account. They froze his account. They told him, if you fight us, you can either accept, take a felony, walk away, leave us all your money, don't bother fighting us. Or you can fight us, but now we've frozen your account, so you have no money to fight us, and you're probably still going to lose because now you have no money to hire an attorney to fight this claim. Right?
Abuse of
and
power.
Then, you know what they do with that money? Most people don't know what they do with that money.
Tell me.
They take it and they split it. They split it. When they confiscate people's bank accounts like that, they split it between the state and usually maybe some federal agency. So they literally just claim your money and split it. And this happens all the time. It's like straight up theft. Like there's no other way to describe it.
It's abuse of power.
It's abuse of power. And it's so sad. Like, as a lawyer, I see this stuff happening all the time. Remember my first year, it was just a first year in law school. They made me write a brief on how a case was supposed to come out, and they presented it to the court. And I did all the research, man. I knew that law like this. I was absolutely right at how this case, all the precedent says this case should turn out like this. So I listed everything, gave it to them. They go to court. The judge decided the other way. This was like a tort case against some poor pregnant woman who had trauma in birth or whatever, right? The judge decides the other way. And I was like, how can they decide against the law? That's literally the law. It's all the precedent, all the court cases right there. And they were like, well, the judge can kind of decide whatever they want. And mostly nobody's going to very rarely is it ever going to, get appealed or come back to them, right? And of course, this poor mother couldn't afford to appeal the case, right? So, when I just seeing all of that in our legal system, made me so upset and so angry about how it's not like we have this ideal in America that we have this great legal system and everything. But over the years, it has been worn away, all of these principles. And so, and we have our government literally abusing power. Right?
Yeah, we have political appointments of unqualified people to be judges, and no standards for training judges to make sure they know what they're doing.
Yeah, or to make sure they know the law, right? I mean, it's like, how can they not make them study the law and the basis for the law, right? The foundation of the law.
Yep.
So
it's sad. Let's be on a more optimistic, social advocacy, more power to ex-members who've experienced the loss of our autonomy, gotten our minds back, where, I look at you as a role model of incredibly bright, talented, creative, ambitious, successful former member who said, I don't want to be there and be a baby machine and just, do the laundry. Like, I want to learn. I want to grow. I want to travel. I want to contribute. Let's inspire some former members, because I have a lot of former members who like to listen to this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, a lot of people ask me, how are you so okay? Right? Like, you seem like I'm generally happy. Of course, I do have anxiety sometimes and so on, but like in general, I'm happy. I'm a productive member of society. I'm not on drugs. I'm not like, I do binge watch TV sometimes, but
naughty you.
But to just talking to people and saying, how did you get there, right? I think one thing for me was, I did memorize a lot of the Bible, and I had this belief in God that everything was going to work out for the good eventually, right? Or that I could take these experiences and turn them into something good, right? And that was a core belief I had as a child. And I used that over and over and over when I was suffering. I would keep, quoting this verse, all things work together for good to them that love God. And then I would think about, well, how could this possibly work together for my good? And I didn't realize I was using a very effective psychological technique, because I was future pacing myself. I was looking to the future in a time when I would not be in this moment of extreme pain and I would be out of it, and I could be using this and some benefit might come from it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that is an amazing psychological technique, is to ask yourself, well, how might this help me in the future? How might this make me stronger? Or how might this make me more compassionate or more
Yes.
understanding on someone else's sufferings, right? And I think that is a very powerful tool. It doesn't
Definitely.
negate the bad thing happening to you. It doesn't make it okay.
Right.
And the other thing was that I had to make a choice. I had to make a choice that it was up to me. And this is one of the core things of this framework, is when I understood I own myself fully. That means all of this is mine, my thoughts, my emotions, my actions. I'm the only one that can do anything for myself today.
Mm-hmm.
No matter the bad stuff that happened to me, and now I can clearly identify and name the bad stuff that happened to me because I have the framework. I can say this was a violation of the principle of my body. This was a violation of the principle of undue pressure. This was a violation of my creation, right? I can name it so I know exactly what was wrong about it. And that's also very helpful in clarifying for somebody who suffered abuse. At the same time, I recognized at this point, I had to take full responsibility for myself, for my own healing, for my own development. And I said, what do I want? Do I want to be miserable? Do I want to be happy? Like, those are the choices, really.
Yeah.
Right? And I said, I'm going to be happy. I want to be successful. And I'm going to go after that aggressively, right?
Yes.
And it's just simple logic exercise, right? And a lot of people don't do it. A lot of people are like, oh, well, I need to stay damaged or hurt because that's going to punish my parents who did these terrible things. Well, it's not really going to punish them, frankly.
No.
Because if they didn't care about you enough to abuse you, do you think they're really going to care if you're still suffering now? Like,
Right.
So just that ability to say, okay, this is what I want. I'm going to go for it. And it's my responsibility now. Like, I can't do anything about what happened to me in the past, but I can get therapy. I can do psychological techniques. I can, work on my mental state. I can do all of these things to bring myself into a better, more healthy place in my life so I can really enjoy happiness, success, and relationships.
Yeah, and the proof is in the pudding. We've arrived at similar conclusions, even though I'm older than you and I've been, trained as a mental health professional. If I may, I'll just say what I've come up with my clients is, first of all, instead of looking to me to fix them, I take the model of you need to fix yourself. You need to, own your own mind, your own body. So being in your body is the cure to a dissociative disorder, which is what brainwashing and mind control is diagnostically. Being in the here and now with a future positive orientation, with an internal locus of control, not looking out to someone else to tell you what reality is or what God wants for you, but where you are listening to God within you. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And having the smarts to have a toolbox to analyze, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing. It's a bad thing because of this. It's a good thing because of that. And learning through experience so you don't make the same mistakes of judgment over and over, and listening to other people's experiences so you can learn vicariously from their stories too. So,
Absolutely.
you're expressing kind of where I've come out after all of these decades. It's so simple. It's your mind. You should control it. And we are embodied minds. It's not mind-body split. Any group that says your body's evil and ignore it and whatever, that's not healthy.
No, because guess what? Your brain is inside here. It's part of the body. It's one of the organs of the body.
And I would say we have a gut brain too,
yes,
and a heart
we
brain
do.
too.
We do.
It's not just the skull brain.
Well,
right?
And this is why this is so powerful, because this is a tool for your toolbox, right?
Exactly.
This is a tool for your toolbox where you can put that in and you can ask yourself, and this is about healthy boundaries. Is somebody telling me that I don't fully own myself, that I need to do what they're saying? Is somebody trying to say that they have some kind of right to my creations, right? Or that I need to turn them over? And, looking at the deal and the element of undue pressure, right? It's like, this is a checklist that you can go through both check yourself in a relationship, but also to check your leaders, your government, your religious leaders, whoever it is, and say, okay, are they violating any of these principles? Now, the reason I recognized this was so important was because without a clear, simple, just standard of principles where if somebody
Sure.
violates that, that is wrong. It doesn't matter
Mm-hmm.
what reason, doesn't matter for God, doesn't matter for family, doesn't matter for, any of
Right.
that stuff. If they're violating a principle that's on there, I own my body, I own my creations, the elements of a good deal, right? Then
Mm-hmm.
you already know that it's wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so then you get to choose. It frees you to make a choice.
Right. Knowing helps you to have boundaries to go, wait a minute, this person, like I loved your example about somebody taking you to dinner, but they want to get in your pants. It's like, wait a minute, boundary. Like, what's the expectation? And to be really clear about expectations.
Yes.
And
Yeah. And the other thing for a legal perspective, too, is this is one of the areas that I think this really helps, and I would like to see it used in these kind of court cases, is when we're talking about rape, right? So often the conversation when someone gets raped goes to all these other things like, well, was she dressed sexy, or she was, drunk, or she was making out with the person, or she was making herself available, or like they would throw all this mud at the screen basically. But when you understand every human has an absolute right to the autonomy of their own body, and that
yeah,
nobody should have sex with them unless they actively consent, right?
right.
With a clear mind, then
And have the
and have the
capacity.
capacity, they're not totally drunk out of their head, right?
Right.
Then you know what the standard is, right? And so then you can make a decision in that court case in a very different way. And it's not confused by, oh, she was wearing a short skirt. Well, who cares if she's wearing a short skirt, right? Just because my car is painted hot red doesn't mean you can steal it. It doesn't matter, right?
Right.
Just because my
Uh,
wallet's out on the table and it's convenient to take, if you steal it, it's still stealing, right? So
yeah,
when
exactly.
they have this clarity about what it means for our bodies, especially as women, because this often gets obscured through the cultural norms, right? Then
Yep.
it gives us a clear way to, present these kind of court cases in court, uh, in the law, and I think hopefully get people justice.
Yeah, exactly. I do want to say boys are raped too. It's
Absolutely.
not only women, and women can control men and take it, take them over and exploit them as well. But at least in the UK, they've passed a coercive control law now. I'm sure you're aware of it, where a man controlling a woman, isolating her, making her dependent, etc., is now a crime. And I heard that Ireland, which recently passed the law, actually prosecuted and sentenced the first person for abusing a woman that way.
And
So
you
this,
are right. There is, I think the statistics show, I think it's like the
one
percentage
in
of
six.
people who are abused is 90 something percent is women, but there is still a very significant percentage of men who are abused, especially when they're young,
Yeah.
especially as boys. And I've actually talked to a lot of them after they've
Mm.
read my work and stuff. They've said, "Hey, this happened to me too,
Yeah.
actually."
Yep.
And it is very difficult, very damaging. So it's absolutely not just something that happens to women. And the coercive control that we're talking about, not just even sexual abuse, it happens to all of us all the time, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's that, and that's what we really need to become more aware of as a society.
Yep. So we're wrapping up. I wanted to ask you, are you aware of the I Got Out effort of to try, like Me Too? We're trying to like destigmatize. Hey, happened to me. I was in the Mooney cult and I got out and I have two masters and a PhD and
Yes, I
have
was
a
on
good
their
life.
podcast. I was on the I Got Out
Ah,
podcast.
okay, awesome.
Yes, so you
Yeah,
can look for
so
that.
we want to encourage more people if you have a story, it wasn't your fault. something happened, and the key is like reclaiming your power and moving forward in a positive way and knowing that there's a community of us. There are many tens of millions of us, frankly, out there. And we know what it's like to lose our freedom. So we really cherish the ability to decide for ourselves, our own destiny,
Absolutely.
right?
And my parents have been out now for years, and people often say, well, how can you forgive them? Like, I have a good relationship with them now. But they have learned, they recognize what happened, they recognize what, they did. And I've shared this framework with them, and I've had very good discussions with my mother, both about like her own experiences. She also had terrible experiences in the
Mm,
group. She wasn't just abusive to me, everybody was abusive to her. And
of
that abuse had been
course.
happening even before she entered the group, so because it was very prevalent in society at that time. So
Yep.
it's just uh, I think I've been able to take a step back and look at my parents and look at other people as people, right? And see the
Mm,
influences that were at play in their lives. Yes, they made bad decisions. It doesn't
yeah.
change the fact that that was wrong or that was abusive, but I also understand it. And what I look at is, can somebody admit they're wrong and change and move forward, right? And
Exactly.
and if that's the case, then you know I welcome that, right? I
Yeah,
that's
totally.
that's where we should be coming from. So, uh, you know, most of these cults they really get people when they're at a young, vulnerable age, and they're trying to
Or
or
situational
situational
vulnerability,
vulnerability.
divorce, death of a loved one, illness, moving to a new city, state, or country, losing a job. There's a life cycle events that cause more, vulnerability. But the biggest vulnerability, Faith, is just ignorance that it can happen to you. That you think, I'm too smart. It would never happen to me. And it's like, whoa,
I didn't they do a study that said that it's generally smarter people that it happens to?
I,
I
you know,
believe
that
that was a
I
thing.
don't know if it's scientific, but I mean, 47 years, they're some of the most brilliant, talented, creative people on the planet grew up in a mind control cult or got recruited or in a country that's a dictatorship that functions like a mind control cult. And so for me, I say the more mind you have, the more it can be controlled. The more you want to improve yourself or make the world better,
hmm
those motivations can be twisted and co-opted for someone else's power, power, money, or sex
I like
ambitions.
that. I think that's a good way to express it.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to meeting you in person. Are you open to doing like a law journal article or something? Maybe we could combine our models and do something for lawyers and judges to like say, hey, there's not a slippery slope here. There's actually,
A way to clarify it and identify
yeah,
what each of these principles are. Yeah,
yeah.
I think that could be very interesting.
Great. I
Yeah.
look forward to it. I hope to meet you someday and continued success.
You
And
too.
thanks
And
so much.
congratulations for all the work that you've done, all the books you've published and your dissertation and how you're moving this topic forward. I think it's very easy for a lot of people who get out of cults to just try to ignore it, just try to
Yeah,
walk away, block it,
compartmentalize it. Yeah.
and so it takes a lot of courage to go back and confront it and talk about it and then work to develop something to help people move out of it. So I want to
Yeah.
commend you for that.
Thank you. I had no idea when I first got out I would spend my life doing this work. I can assure you, I had no clue how many other destructive cults there were or just how like it's the number one issue right now on the planet is the issue of the undue influence and how people are harming each other with disinformation and phobia programming and all this other stuff through the internet. And the only cure is psychoeducation, just people sharing their stories, explaining it in simple ways that people can adopt and realize, yeah, we need to know this. We need to teach our kids this. We
Mm-hmm.
need to teach our parents this.
And critical
So,
thinking, which is just sadly lacking in all forms of schooling. It's one thing you actually get trained in when you become a lawyer, and I'm just shocked that we don't train. I mean, I know why we don't train people in it at a
mm,
younger age because it's much easier to control a population that is not analytical and critical thinkers. But
I
Definitely to
totally
parents need to focus on
I
that.
totally agree. And homeschooling, unless it's really top notch, where they're teaching science and how to analyze fallacious logic statements and understand social psychology methods for manipulation. So we really need to roll up our sleeves, and I'm all for binge watching occasionally, but also my son is 20 and he's like into video gaming. It's like, dude, less time on the video gaming, like learn some skills and like make a life for yourself,
Yeah,
you
it's just
know?
such a distraction culture right now where people don't, they can't focus attention. Like, in order to think critically, you have to be able to have an extended focus of attention. But with
Exactly.
everything moving faster and faster and faster, just like flashing adverts and all this stuff, people can't think through it critically. It's just designed to trigger emotion after emotion. Um,
Exactly.
and that is really, really dangerous.
Yeah. Thank you, Faith Jones. Sex Cult Nun, I Own Me, and your moral framework for reality testing. And
Yes.
like it's my body and I am my own property. No one else has a right to control me. So kudos to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Steve. Bye.
Okay. Bye.